There's a people living across 40 countries right now in the millions who Europe has been calling by the wrong name for 700 years straight. A name built on a lie so old that it eventually became law, became policy, and became justification for 5 centuries of slavery, mass expulsion, and finally genocide. The name is Gypsy. The lie is Egypt. And DNA just proved that the truth was something nobody in power ever wanted to take the time to find out. Because if they had found out the truth, it would have been far more difficult to do what Europe did to these people. This is not a story that gets taught in schools. This is not a story that sits comfortably in history textbooks. This is the story that science finally dragged into the open after 7 centuries of deliberate silence. And it begins not in Europe, not in Egypt, not with a mystery. It begins with the people who always knew exactly who they were. The world just refused to listen to them long enough to find out. When Roma people first appeared in Western Europe around the year 1300, the continent had no idea what to make of them. They arrived in caravans, moving through cities and across borders with a fluency that baffled and frightened settled populations. They spoke a language that no European scholar could identify or place. They carried with them remarkable skills in metalwork, in music, in horse trading, and craft. And those skills seemed to come from nowhere that anyone could trace. European authorities looked at them and needed a category, needed an origin, needed a label that would make sense of these people who fit no existing box. And the answer they landed on was lazy, wrong, and catastrophically consequential. They called them Egyptians. They assumed these dark-complexioned, skilled, mobile people had wandered north from Egypt, perhaps pilgrims, perhaps refugees, and the name collapsed into a slur over the following centuries. In English, Egyptian became gypsy. In Spanish, it became gitano. In Romanian, it became tigan, pulled from an old Greek word meaning heretic and untouchable. In every language, the name encoded the same message. These people are not from here. These people do not belong. And that message, built on a complete geographic fiction, was used to justify nearly everything that followed. The Roma themselves were never confused about who they were. They had a name for themselves, they had a language, they had a living cultural memory that stretched back further than any European authority bothered to ask about. But for 700 years, nobody asked. And the Roma paid for that silence in ways that are almost impossible to fully reckon with. Before DNA entered the picture and changed everything, there was one enormous clue hiding in plain sight that should have corrected the historical record centuries before science ever needed to step in. That clue was the Romani language itself. In 1763, a Hungarian student named István Valley was studying in the Netherlands when he encountered students who had traveled from the Malabar coast of India. When they began to speak, something happened that Valley could not explain and could not ignore. He recognized words, not similar-sounding words, not words that vaguely rhymed. The same words. Words that Roma people across Europe were using every single day of their ordinary lives. The Romani word for water is pauni. In Hindi and Sanskrit, the word for water is pani. The Romani word for hand is vast. The Sanskrit word for hand is hasta. The Romani word for black is kalo. The Sanskrit word is kala. The Romani word for bread is maro. In northern Indian languages, it is maru. Linguists who followed Valley's initial discovery spent the next 2 centuries pulling on that thread and found it went deeper than anyone expected. Romani was not borrowed from Sanskrit. It was not a European language that had absorbed Indian loanwords over time. It was an ancient Indian language, belonging to the same Indo-Aryan family as Hindi, Punjabi, and Kashmiri, that had been carried west across thousands of miles of desert, mountain, and hostile empire and preserved with almost supernatural faithfulness for over 1,000 years. The grammar, the verb structures, the core vocabulary, all of it pointed in one unmistakable direction. Whoever the Roma were, they had come from India. The language had been shouting that fact since the moment the Roma arrived in Europe. But knowing the direction is not the same as knowing the distance. The language could say India. It could not say when, where exactly, how many people, why they left, or what route they took. For those answers, scientists eventually needed to go deeper than words. They needed to go into the blood itself. And what the blood told them in the early 2000s, and confirmed again and again through increasingly sophisticated testing in the years that followed, was not just surprising. It was one of the most remarkable origin stories in all of human history. In 2012, a landmark study published in the journal Current Biology brought the full weight of modern genetics to bear on the question of Roma origins for the first time at a large scale. A research team analyzed the genomes of 13 different Roma populations scattered across Europe. From Spain in the far west to Finland in the far north, from Scotland in the northwest to Bulgaria in the southeast. These were populations that had been separated from each other for generations. living under completely different conditions, speaking regional dialects that had diverged significantly from each other, and in many cases, having had very little contact with other Roma groups for centuries. What the genetic analysis found across all of them was something that silenced doubt about the question of Roma origin permanently. Every single Roma population in Europe, regardless of where they lived, regardless of how long they had been there, regardless of what European populations they had lived alongside, shared a single common ancestor population. One founding group, one original community, not a scattered migration of unrelated Indian groups across different times and routes. One founding population that had left a specific part of the Indian subcontinent together, and whose descendants had eventually spread across an entire continent. And the location of that founding population was identified through genetic markers, with a precision that the linguistic evidence alone could never have provided. The Roma DNA pointed to northwestern India, specifically to the regions that today make up the states of Punjab, Rajasthan, and Haryana. The genetic markers most characteristic of Roma populations, including specific Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that show up across all European Roma communities, are predominantly found today in populations living in exactly those regions of northern India. The most significant genetic affinity, confirmed through analysis of shared DNA segments, was with Punjabi groups from northwestern India. A 2017 study published in BMC Genomic Data, working with a significantly larger data set of 179 Roma samples and 51 distinct Indian ethnic groups, refined this finding further, identifying the strongest shared ancestry signals precisely in Punjab, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. And then a further study published in PLOS Genetics confirmed what the others had been building toward, that all European Roma share a common South Asian origin closely related to a Punjabi group from northwestern India, with a common Balkan ancestry layered on top from their time passing through southeastern Europe on the way west. But the genetics did not stop at identifying where the Roma came from. It also told researchers approximately when the founding population left India. And that answer was around 1,500 years ago, somewhere in the region of 500 AD. That timing is not arbitrary, and it did not happen in a historical vacuum. The 5th and 6th centuries AD in northern India were a period of catastrophic upheaval. The Gupta Empire, which had presided over a golden age of culture, science, mathematics, and stability across the Indian subcontinent for over a century, was collapsing under the pressure of the Huna invasions, a wave of nomadic incursions from Central Asia that tore through northern India, burned cities, disrupted trade routes, and displaced enormous numbers of people. Populations that had been settled for generations found themselves suddenly homeless, suddenly without the economic or social structures that had organized their lives. The DNA-derived date of the Roma departure from India places it squarely inside this period of collapse and displacement. It suggests the founding population did not leave by choice on a peaceful journey of exploration. They left because the world they had lived in was being destroyed around them. They were refugees from a catastrophe that history has not spent nearly enough time examining, and their descendants became the Roma people of Europe. And then the genetics revealed something that stopped researchers in their tracks, something that transforms this entire story from remarkable into almost incomprehensible. When scientists analyzed the founding population's size, what they found was a genetic bottleneck so extreme that it borders on the statistically miraculous. Genetic bottleneck analysis, which looks at patterns of genetic diversity to estimate how many individuals a population descended from, showed that the entire modern Roma population of Europe descended from a founding group that may have numbered only a few hundred people at the absolute maximum. A few hundred people. From that impossibly small number across 1,500 years of migration, persecution, slavery, and genocide, the Roma population grew to between 10 and 12 million people spread across 40 countries today. That is one of the most extraordinary demographic survival stories in the entire recorded history of the human species. There's almost no parallel for it anywhere. A tiny group of refugees from a collapsing empire in northern India became Europe's largest ethnic minority, carrying their language and culture and genetic identity intact through every catastrophe that history threw at them for 15 centuries. The DNA says that survival was real and it was not accidental. It was the product of a fierce and deliberate commitment to keeping the community alive, to maintaining identity, to refusing erasure even when the forces arrayed against them were the most powerful institutions in the world. The genetics also answered the question that historians and anthropologists had argued about for years without resolution. Who were the Roma in India before they left? What was their social position? What did they do? The genetic markers associated with Roma populations pointed to specific occupational and social groups in ancient Indian society, groups who were traditionally metalworkers, musicians, craftspeople, and traders. Groups whose identity was tied not to a fixed geographic location, but to a set of skills and a way of moving through the world. This was not a coincidence. Traditional Roma culture across Europe in communities that had been completely separated from each other for hundreds of years consistently placed extraordinary value on exactly those things: metalworking, music, trade, craftsmanship, the ability to move, to adapt, to survive in hostile environments through skill rather than through territorial ownership. European authorities spent 7 centuries interpreting Roma mobility as rootlessness, as aimlessness, as evidence of a people who belonged nowhere. The genetics reveals it for what it actually was: an ancient occupational identity formed over generations in India that the Roma carried with them across 3 continents in 15 centuries, because it was not just a way of making a living, it was who they were. The Roma did not become metalworkers and musicians somewhere on the road between India and Spain. They were metalworkers and musicians before they ever left India, and the DNA confirmed every word of what their own cultural memory had always maintained. From northwestern India, the founding population moved westward through what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, then through Persia, which is modern-day Iran, then through Armenia and the Caucasus region, then into the Byzantine Empire across modern Turkey and Greece. The genetic evidence shows that the Roma spent significant time in Anatolia, the region that makes up most of modern Turkey, where they absorbed some genetic influence from local populations over generations of settlement. That Anatolian genetic signal sits clearly visible in the DNA of every Roma person alive today. It is a fingerprint of the centuries their ancestors spent in the Eastern Byzantine world before the final movement westward into Europe. By around 1000 AD, the Roma were entering the Balkans in significant numbers. By 1300, they had reached Western Europe. By 1500, they were present in every corner of the continent. A journey of thousands of miles across 15 centuries, encoded in the blood of 12 million people living today. And understanding where the Roma truly came from makes what Europe then did to them almost unbearable to look at directly. Because what Europe did to these people, it did to people it had completely misunderstood, people whose history and identity it had never bothered to investigate, people whose own account of themselves it had dismissed without examination. In Romania and Wallachia, which were the Romanian principalities, the Roma were enslaved. Not metaphorically, not in the loose sense that the word is sometimes used. Legally, formally, completely enslaved from the 14th century until 1856. That is nearly 500 years of chattel slavery, which is a form of bondage comparable to the African-American slavery of the American South, in which Roma people were born into legal ownership, were bought and sold at auction, were given as gifts at weddings, and donated to monasteries by princes hoping to buy divine favor. The first written record of Roma enslavement in Wallachia dates to 1385, when a prince named Dan I donated 40 Roma families to the Tismana monastery as property. The legal code of Wallachia in the early 19th century still stated explicitly that Roma shall be born only as slaves, and that anyone born of a slave mother shall also become a slave. Their masters owned their bodies. Masters decided who slaves could marry. Masters decided what language slaves could speak. Masters had the legal right to sell the children of enslaved Roma away from their parents. Roma women were routinely raped by their owners. And when slavery was finally abolished in 1856, the 250,000 Roma people who became legally free that day received nothing. No land, no reparations, no acknowledgement that 5 centuries of their labor had built the wealth of Romanian aristocrats in the church. The enslavers, on the other hand, received financial compensation from the government for the loss of their property. History has not taught this story with anything approaching the seriousness it deserves. The Roma enslavement in the Romanian principalities lasted longer than American slavery and has received a fraction of the historical attention. Outside Romania, the persecution took different forms but lost none of its intensity. Across medieval Western Europe, Roma were expelled from country after country in waves of official hostility that stretched across centuries. They were banned from owning property, banned from practicing trades, banned from speaking their own language in public, banned from settling in permanent structures. They were publicly flogged in some countries, branded in others, executed in others, simply for the crime of existing as Roma. In some parts of Europe, it was literally legal to hunt and kill Roma people. These were not the actions of individual prejudice. These were the official policies of governments and churches, enacted against a people whose true identity and whose extraordinary history they had never taken the most basic steps to understand. And then came the 20th century, and the worst of it. Under Adolf Hitler, the Nazi regime defined Roma and Jews under the same Nuremberg laws as enemies of the race-based state. The Roma were subjected to the same process of systematic identification, registration, deportation, and murder that was applied to Jewish communities across Europe. Roma men, women, and children were sent to Dachau, Mauthausen, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a specific camp section was designated for Roma prisoners. On February 26, 1943, the first transport of Roma arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Of the 23,000 Roma imprisoned in that camp, over 20,000 were murdered. On August 2nd, 1944, the Roma camp at Auschwitz was liquidated, and thousands of people were gassed in a single night. Roma were also killed in mass shootings across occupied eastern Poland, Serbia, and the Soviet Union, in operations that history has documented far less thoroughly than it has documented comparable operations against other victim groups. The Roma call this genocide the Porajmos, which means the devouring. Estimates of the death toll range from 220,000 to 500,000 people, with some scholars arguing the true number may be higher. The Nazi regime killed between a quarter and a half of all Roma people in Europe. West Germany did not formally recognize that a genocide had been committed against Roma until 1982. Poland did not acknowledge it until 2011. The first official European Day of Remembrance for Roma victims of the Holocaust was not established until 2015. The survivors of the Porajmos received no reparations for decades, and early post-war German governments actively blocked their claims on the grounds that the Nazis had targeted Roma not for racial reasons, but because of their supposed criminal and antisocial behavior, which was itself a repetition of the exact racist logic the Nazis had used to justify the murder in the first place. And today, in 2024 and 2025, with all of this history now documented and in some cases officially acknowledged, the Roma remain the most discriminated against ethnic minority in Europe. The European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights published a survey in 2024 covering Roma populations across 13 European countries. Its findings were not a record of progress. 80% of Roma surveyed live below the poverty line in their home country. Every third Roma person lives in housing without running tap water. Every third Roma child lives in a household where someone went to bed hungry at least once in the previous month. 31% of Roma people reported experiencing discrimination based on their ethnicity in the previous 12 months alone, across employment, education, healthcare, housing, and public services. These are not the statistics of a people who have been welcomed into European society after centuries of persecution. These are the statistics of a people who are still waiting for Europe to actually reckon with what was done to them. The DNA evidence published across multiple studies, refined most recently in a paper published in BMC Genomic Data in March 2025, working with expanded datasets and more advanced analytical methods, does not just tell us where the Roma came from. It demands that we honestly confront what was done to them after they arrived. Because the lie of Egyptian origin was never just a geographic error. It was a tool, a classification that placed the Roma outside the recognized order of European peoples, outside the categories that carried protection and legal standing, outside the circle of those to whom ordinary moral obligations applied. If the Roma were mysterious wanderers from somewhere unspecified, if they had no real origin and no real history, then they could be enslaved and expelled and murdered without too much philosophical difficulty. The lie made the atrocities easier. The truth makes them impossible to excuse. The truth is that the Roma are the descendants of a specific ancient civilization in northwestern India. They are the carriers of one of the oldest continuously preserved languages on Earth. They are the survivors of a 1,500-year journey across 3 continents that began in catastrophe and continued through 15 centuries of hostility and violence that would have erased most human communities from the face of the earth. They maintained their genetic distinctness, their language, their music, their craftsmanship, and their identity through 5 centuries of slavery in Romania, through centuries of expulsion across Western Europe, and through a 20th century genocide that the world spent decades refusing to fully acknowledge. Their cultural memory was accurate. Their language was real. Their identity was ancient and coherent and their own. It just took the rest of the world 1,500 years in a genetics laboratory to finally catch up with what the Roma had known all along. The DNA spoke. Now the question is whether the world is finally ready to listen to the answer and to take seriously what that answer demands of us.